So let's just go ahead and get going here. All right, so the topics we're going to try to cover today is gear, what kind of gear you use. It's typically a lot like the salmon gear that you would normally have, but there are a few exceptions that, or at least what I've found that's worked better for me. Calendar of fishing, and then we'll go into some of the specific areas that I fish. And you can kind of see that there's probably hundreds of more places that you could try it at, but really, I've fished all year. I've caught tons of fish just fishing these areas. So I want to try to give you some specific information that when you do go out, you know, the first few times I went out, I got blanked just like everybody else. And over the years, more and more, I'm starting to get consistent in that fishery. So let me try to relay some of the information that I've got. Once again, it is not, I am not the sole authority on it. And what I'm going to tell you is that try new things, try new places, you will be amazed. I grew up in Kenai, Alaska, went K through 12 there, and that's why a lot of you guys know me as Cardinal 84 on the forums. But it just amazes me that you can get on a kayak and do this year round. And not only that, you're not catching, you know, cod or pollock, you're catching king salmon, big halibut, cohos, and it's just an absolute blast. And I think it's one of those things that I have a real passion for, and hopefully you will too after this. All right, so some of the fishing gear we'll talk about here real quick. Once again, you can pretty much use anything you'd like. One of the videos maybe later if we have time that I'll show you is I've caught halibut and king salmon using a Barbie rod last year. And it really is an issue that it's the kayak that allows you to do that, and I'll explain a little bit more here. So the rods. Here's my favorite rod. It's a Seeker Hercules. I think it's rated for something on the order of 60 to 70 pounds. Pretty thick stick. I use a Truth Release. That's about the same size as an Avid SX or an Abu Garcia 6000. So you don't really need anything huge here. And one of the reasons is you don't fish real deep. When I fish deep, 150, 200 feet, I will step up to a TLD 20. A little bit more that looks like a halibut reel. And it's only just because it picks up line faster. But what I'm going to tell you here today is you don't have to fish deep. If you've got a kayak, you can catch big halibut in shallow water. You can catch kings 10 yards off the shore. And so let me go ahead and get more on that. But one of the things that I have learned is that I prefer a heavy stick. Once again, I use this for silver fishing. I use it for kings. I use it for halibut. And it's because why would you use a long, softer rod? Why? And it's because you're trying to protect the line, or you know, you don't want the hook to pull out. So you don't need to do that on a kayak. The kayak will give with the fish. You catch a 5-pound fish, it'll turn your kayak around. And in addition to that, when I get to the reels, I'm going to tell you to keep your drag super light. So when you have a fish on and you're bringing it in, one of the things that everybody tells you on a charter or anything is don't high stick your rod. Why is that? Well, it's because if you use a normal rod, you'll snap it. And so when you kayak fish, you have to high stick your rod to get the fish into the net. So that's one of the reasons I like a stiff stick. Also, when you have a light, soft stick, you can come back all you want and the fish keeps taking off. You can imagine that if you had a broomstick or something, a short broomstick, and a solid piece of rope, it's way easier to guide the fish into the net than it is when you have a long limber rod where the fish is just kind of going crazy and there's nothing you can do about it. One of the things that I would recommend though is, even though I said I caught fish on a Barbie rod, I use a 12.5-foot kayak. So you want a rod that's about half that length at least, because then when the fish runs, you can kind of go around the tip of your, or in the back. So as a general rule, I use 6.5 to 7-foot sticks. Anything longer just gets in your way. Reels, you can use, once again, just about anything you have, but I really like the lever drag reels. So another thing that I was taught growing up was once you have a fish on, don't touch the drag. And it's like, sorry, Dad. But in kayak fishing, you kind of need to be able to at least compensate for the drag. Now, I use star drag reels. My son uses star drag reels, and that's okay. But if you do that, you want to set your drag really light. First of all, there's no hurry. I suppose if you guys see my videos, you might disagree with me because I'm always yelling at my kid to hurry up. But there's really no hurry, and a lot of times with this, you know, you got a net in one hand, you got the rod in the other hand. I use a spectral line, braided line, and so there's very little give on a short stick. More than once, I've just about lost my rod as I'm trying to net a fish. Fish takes off, you only have one hand on the rod, so keep your drag light, and if you got a lever drag reel, you can set it pretty hard for the strike, and then you can back off of it very easily to fight the fish. So I really like the lever drag reels. I would recommend that if you're just starting out with new tackle. The lines, more and more as I fish, whether it be for 5-pound pinks or 200-pound halibut, I'm using 50 to 65-pound Power Pro line. It's a braided line. A lot of folks don't like it. I certainly wouldn't recommend it if you're fishing 6 lines out of a boat with novices or even with expertise, but in kayak fishing you don't have to worry about that. You know, you only have one line out. So braided line, it's a little less forgiving than mono, but once again, you're only fishing one line, and I love the fact that you can just feel every head shake and feel every tap. Very sensitive line. Terminal tackle, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here in a second. Landing gear is something to discuss real quick with salmon, and it's a little counterintuitive. I say this in my intro class too, but I use a light net. I love buying gear, and I love buying high-end gear. Fishing's about the only thing I ever do, but with the net, don't. Because what does a nice, solid, expensive net mean? It means it's well built, it means it's heavy. You're doing a lot of stuff with one hand, it doesn't work as well. You can't lift up on the fish. Number two, you know, I have all these river nets that are, you know, safe catch and release, rubber mesh, but when you stick that on the back of your kayak, all that does is act as a sail. And so you don't want that either. So what I suggest to folks is to go out and buy the cheapest, lightest net that you think will handle the fish, and that's going to work better than any of the top-end nets. Another piece of equipment that I like are these Boca grips. The one here, they're a little crazy expensive, $250 maybe. There is another company called Lucid Grips that make virtually the exact same thing, and they're under $100. I would recommend those. I think I just lost Boga as a sponsor, but these work great. For salmon, you know, I'm using the net 99% of the time. When I catch and release in the salt water, though, I use the Boga grips. I don't really grab the fish on most cases. What I do is I use this as a hook remover. You know, put it on the line, slide it down, and then line this way, point, and it'll pop it out. So these work great. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I halibut fish. Another piece of gear that I highly recommend you get, it's one of the mandatory gears, is a dive clip. And these are used for spear fishing, but I really like them on a kayak. You know, even big halibut, once they're subdued, or salmon, you can string them up, put them in the water, they bleed out great. Also, when you throw them out into the back of your kayak, I've had more than one fish flop out. This prevents that. Works great for red fishing, or like if you're dip netting from the shore, these work great too. So, something that to consider. So let's see here. So specific terminal gear. So there's 3 basic types of weights, I guess, you know, methods that I employ to get bait down. The one that I use by far is a sinker. And I use sinkers that are a lot heavier than what most people might expect. I would say the average weight I use is about 10 ounces. With braided line, often I'm trolling a big flasher. It helps to get my gear down. I'm not running a motor, so I'm not too worried about noise. I've never had any issues catching fish right below me. And it just makes it easier to control. I would say that an 8 to 10 ounce sinker, normally trolling at say a knot and a half, 2 knots, it's good down to about 30 feet if you let out 80, 100 feet of line. A diver is pretty good. Whenever I need to get down a little under 30 feet, say 30 to 50 feet range, I use the Deep 6 divers. Not a huge fan of them. They're just a lot of drag, and it's just another piece of gear, but they are very effective. A lot of us guys now, when we're fishing deep, we'll use downriggers, or when we know that our fish are at a specific level, we use downriggers. And these kayaks are so stable that there's just no issue utilizing that, and I'll show you the use of that as well. The flashers that we use, it's a little bit different than what I would use off of a power boat. The system I like the most is this triangular flasher. And the reason for that is any flasher that spins on its axis straight, you can attach the weight directly to the flasher. Now, if you fish salmon off of boats and you use big flashers, you know, the ones that swing side to side like this, you can't attach it directly to the weight. You need like 6 inches, a foot minimum to get the proper action. Why is that important? It's important because when you reel up all your gear, you know, you reel it all the way up, boink, it's got to be, the rule of thumb is the total leader length. Your hooks can't be any longer than your rod. I've seen so many times where guys that tried kayak fishing first, and they bring their stuff that they use on a boat, you know, so they'll have like 2 feet between the sinker and the flasher. They'll use another 6 feet a leader. You're taught kind of to make the leaders longer. There's nothing more frustrating than seeing having a big fish on. It's right there, you're high sticking, and you just can't get at it. And I've seen so many fish lost that way. It's like, don't follow your kayak. So that's another reason I like this flasher. Also, these flashers typically have less drag than the big ones, and so that's good from a kayak fishing point of view. These kayaks, the ones I use have a rudder, but if you don't have a rudder, it'll just keep turning you toward that way. Now, does that mean the other flashers aren't good? No, absolutely not. In fact, off a boat, I like those. You might have seen the Beckhold flashers. They're the big ones with fins on them. You just can't use those on a kayak very effectively because they have too much drag. But what does drag mean? Drag means that you're displacing water. I think that when you displace a lot of water, it kind of gives the vibrations off. It's an attractant to the fish. And so it's kind of a fine line balance between utilizing something that's got a lot of drag and therefore sends out a lot of vibration, or something like this that may have less drag, but it's more effective on a kayak because you have much better line control. So some of the things about bait versus lures, size, what do I mean by that? But the baits, one of the things that I would not emphasize, I guess, but one of the secrets that I use is, I learned this from a really good fisherman in Washington, and he did it because he wanted to line the fish once they hit the bait, not snag them, not like, we're not talking like reds, and I'll show you how that works, but it's called the hangback rig. And so you'll put the first hook goes into the head of the fish, and I'm going to show you how to do that. But the second hook is actually trailing 6 inches to a foot behind the bait. And I'm going to show you why that's effective here in a second, but you'll be amazed at how many times the fish hits the back hook. And I guess I don't know, but it sure looks like they're hitting the back hook. But regardless, even if they strike at the bait and miss, you'll see why they get hooked on that second hook. Lures, typically I use spoons a lot. My favorite is the Silver Horde Coho Killer. Why is that? Well, if you do some research, you know that sand lances, not herring or other baits that typically people think of, are the predominant forage fish in Kachemak Bay and Cook Inlet. And so you can see here the sand lances that I took out of a king's stomach, and you can see the hoochies and the Silver Horde Coho Killer match that profile better than, say, a big herring. I've even caught them on these Mylar tube flies that I just kind of tied together myself, wrapped it, and they work really good as well. So those are the typical things that I use, and my salmon calendar. Not to brag, but I was fortunate enough to get an article in the paper. It just amazes me that this kayak fishing, I was able to go 14 consecutive months catching a king salmon off my kayak. Okay, 2 months I cheated. I went to the mouth of Ship Creek and caught them, but hey, they're kings. But it's amazing to me, growing up in Kenai, that A, you can catch kings year round, B, that you can do it off a kayak. And I'll show you why that's possible here in a second when I reveal all my secret spots. So here's my salmon calendar. January through March, I fish Homer pretty much exclusively. It's really the only place that you have good access. Now, having said that, I know there are kings in Resurrection Bay and maybe even Whittier. It's just that nobody's done it. I know one charter captain that fishes the feeder kings out of Seward, but Homer is certainly consistent. The bad news about January through March is there's not a whole lot of fish to catch. In the Homer Winter King Derby that was held a couple weeks ago, 1,500 anglers, all but 20 were off of power boats. We had 20 kayaks. 448 fish caught. So that's the bad news, right? The good news is, of course, you're fishing in March. That's awesome. But the better news is that the fish you catch will be fairly large. My son was able to catch about a 14.2 pound king. Out of the 3 kings that we caught off the kayak team, that was the smallest. In fact, this year, Jacob Graves caught a 17 poundish king, I think. And he placed 13th overall. So a kayak in this fishery is every bit as effective in terms of getting that fish onto the shore. April through June, as the herring and hooligans start moving into the Cook Inlet, you're going to find that these kings are easier to catch in the lower Cook Inlet. And what I mean by lower Cook Inlet is anywhere from Deep Creek down to Anchor Point. Probably shouldn't be giving away all my spots, but the place to start out is a Whiskey Gulch. And it has to do with the fact that there's that king conservation zone. Having said that, you know, you can catch 2 kings a year if you stay below Bluff Point, which is Anchor Point. So if you continue to hit Homer and you got lucky, it's the limits too. The problem is starting April 1st all the way to September 30th, we run into that annual king limit. And so the kings are pretty, at least they have been the last 3 or 4 years, they're pretty easy in lower Cook Inlet, much more dependable than, say, anything that I've ever fished in river. And the fish are way nicer quality. Now there's no milk, there's no roe, so none of the body fat has gone into the reproductive organs, so it's just a much better eating fish. I know some people say, hey, you know, the kings in Kenai, what are you doing catching so many kings? And it's like, hey, chill out. All the tag studies, all the scales and genetic hatchery studies, none of these kings originate from Cook Inlet. You start getting into May, June, you may catch a spawning king. They'll be big, they'll look different. When you cut them, there'll be roe or milt inside, where I have yet to catch one. Of the many dozens of kings I've caught, they've all been feeder kings. July and September, I start moving towards Seward and Valdez for cohos. I don't fish cohos that much, only because by then my freezer's full of kings and halibut. And coho's a little lower on the pecking order, but man, they're a blast to catch, and I'll show you a quick video of that here in a sec. September to December is go time for kings. You get down to Homer, it's, just as an example, I told you 1,500 anglers caught 448 kings in the March tournament. There's an October tournament that the Homer Elks put on. It's a 2-day derby, so you can weigh in 4 fish. I think the average is something on the order of 2.5 to 3 fish that are weighed in. I expect to limit out in late September through about November. December gets a little bit tougher. The fish are smaller. Instead of 15 to 20 pounds, they'll be more in that 8 to 12 pound range, but a super good eating fish. So let me start talking about some of the specific spots, and we'll even talk specific areas of specific. So Homer Kings, it's definitely my son's favorite. And you know, I'm a miss. Hey, you stand up and turn around and say hello. And so you might have seen his video in the Daily News. It's kind of unofficial, but I'm happy to report that he's outdoing me. He's going pro. He's been sponsored by the Hobie Kayak fishing team, and it's an honor that I wish I could have. But nevertheless, you know, he's a great example, and I have videos up, and it's fun to watch him because you can see the mistakes he's making, but you can see that how you know, you might correct them, and I'll point those out here in a second too. So Homer Feeder Kings. So it's pretty simple. This is where I fish. If you, it's kind of hard to tell, but Land's End Hotel's right on the end, and then you're going to see the condominiums that are next to the Land's End Hotel. One of the things you need to note is that when you're trolling along and you get to about halfway to the condos, it starts shallowing up really quick. Now this is a little old, and I'm going to tell you why, but the normal route I take is something on the order of 50 feet, and this line, the buoy's right around 100 feet, and you can see that it quickly rises up to 32, 40 feet-ish just to the right of it. So there's a nice shelf there. So why is that good? It's really, really good at low tide, especially in the fall time, because you can imagine all the water flowing out of the upper head of the bay here, and what it does is I think it swirls around and it pins the bait fish right up against the shore. This time of year, I've seen guys with surf casting rods catch kings, and so they're really shallow. And so even though this looks deep, this is about the 100-foot line here, 80-foot line. A lot of times we'll be in here fishing 15 feet of water or less. So especially in the fall, September through December fisheries, typically I target them 30 feet and under. Whereas in the winter fisheries, January through March, I'm more in the 50, 60 feet of water. Sometimes we're using downriggers at 80. Every day is different. That's one of the reasons a fish finder is important. You'll see the marks, and then you'll be able to get down to the fish. So some of the considerations, I just got ahead of myself. So those are the depth. By season, especially in the fall, don't be afraid to fish in under 15 feet of water. In that case, you might have to lighten your sinker up a little bit. And once again, I prefer low tide to high tide. Water clarity is an issue. Once you get down there, you'll notice that there's two colors in the water, blue and kind of greenish. And while I've caught fish in the murkier waters, the fishing is always better the clearer the water is. And the weather here, it's really nice, because if you just look up Kayak Bay and it might be 5 knots, blowing 20, as long as there's an east component to the wind, you're very sheltered from the wind, and there's very few times that you cannot get out to launch, especially in between like the Land's End and the condos area. For whatever reason, the surf just doesn't break there. And in my intro seminars, what I tell you is don't worry about flipping over. You have to be prepared for it. But the only time, 99% of the time you're going to flip over is when you're coming in or trying to launch out of big surf. I suppose it could happen on the open water. You probably shouldn't be out there if it's that bad. But my son and I, we've launched out of here, found ourselves in 5 to 6 foot wind waves, pretty hairy even for a boat, but no problem at all. The other thing that I constantly remind my son is to fish the edges. And you're kind of like, what are you talking about? You know, we're talking about an ocean here. But when you look out over the water, you'll notice that some places have ripples, some places have waves, some places are flat calm. You always go to the edges of anything. Whatever you think, oh, you know, that looks different. If you fish the edges, that's where the fishing is often very, very productive. So even though it just looks like blue open water out there, if you pay attention, you'll notice that there are differences in the water, and that's all due to currents and wind. A lot of times you'll see either like a slick, or you'll see a lot of garbage being accumulated in one area. Obviously it's kind of a pain to troll right through all the debris, but if you can get right on the edge of it, that's where the fish are going to be. And so some of the resources that I use even before I go out for salmon is I check the marine weather. That's the National Weather Forecast, NOAA, and NIMS. Another good website, even for the Lower Cook Inlet, is the homerwebcams.com. You look that up, and they have a live feed of the ocean right there, and you can kind of see how the wind's breaking. Also, if you look up the National Data Buoy Center, there will be a list of buoys. There will be a map there. You kind of zoom in, you'll see one right outside of Kayak Bay. And I think I've got a screenshot of that, but the Homer buoy is good. Also, if you have a smartphone, I use the Navionics charts. Super good charts that's got current, tides, and also if you look up Navionics web app on your PC, you'll find that there's a tremendous resource, and the next set of few sets of maps that I'm going to show you are just screenshots from that Navionics web app. Also, probably the most important thing for me when in my intro seminar I say, what's the most dangerous thing about kayak fishing? It's the drive down. And so this Alaska Highway 511 is a key. That's the thing I probably check the most on whether I'm going or not. So I talked a little bit about the hangback rig, and I hope you can see this a little bit. This was off of Homer, and this was in that kind of green, murky water, but it was only one of the times I said it. So I think it's important that as you try to pick up ideas on fishing, that you look up every piece of information you can and then try to interpret it on what's going on here and what's happening. So remember I told you that I like that hangback rig. And so one of the reasons I like it is a really good fisherman told me it worked. 2, I've caught a bunch doing it that way, but I've always kind of wondered why. And I think these videos are a good example of why that is. And so Let's just take a quick look here. It's kind of hard to see, but the bait's right there. And it misses the bait here, but it comes back. And so if you get a tap or something like that, let your line ride for a while. And so, you know, a lot of folks that I've talked to, okay, so what? You know, I'm seeing fish hit here. Well, what I've noticed, and it's not a big deal, but I thought maybe that fish would come zooming up out of the bottom and take it, but you can see that almost every time I've done this, and I've seen the fish, they come up at the same level as the bait. They come up to the level of the bait, follow it, then smash it. And then you can see as soon as they hit the bait, they turn sideways. And that first fish is a really good example that it short struck the herring and missed. And in this particular case, I wasn't using the hangback rig, and it's not 100% effective. But a lot of times when they short strike that herring, they'll get caught as they make that turn, thinking they have it. And so that's one of the reasons the hangback rig works really well. Now, I don't use it in tournaments because a lot of times the first hook catches the fish, and then the second hook is caught on the side. And a lot of tournaments don't allow you to snag fish. And I guess that's technically snagged. If you look at the regulation book, it says you can't attempt to snag a fish. Now, obviously, I think that anything that hits a trolling bait, I don't find it unethical that it misses the bait and hits the side, and you bring it in, because a lot of times by that time they're dead anyways. But check the regulations. But that hangback rig works really well because of this aspect that they, at least yet, of a few other videos that I have, they're not changing depth as they come and hit the lure. They're on the same plane, they strike, and then they move off to the side. And so this would be a good point to also talk about how you set the hook on a kayak, whether you're using a sinker or in this case downrigger. When you see the rod bounce, you gotta avoid the urge to just stop and grab your rod. All that's gonna do is give slack to the fish, and by the time you get your rod out of the holder, you won't be able to set, and you're not really setting the hook. So what I do, and I learned this from back trolling on the Kenai River, as soon as that rod starts tipping, you speed up. And either the lure jolting forward will induce an even stronger strike, or if the bait's in the fish's mouth, the weight of the kayak is what's going to set the hook for you. So as you're trolling along, boink, boink, you see it bumping a little bit, just speed up, go like crazy, and either it'll be hooked, or I think it promotes a bigger, more aggressive strike as the fish feels like the bait's fleeing. So Lower Cook Inlet, once again, this is a Deep Creek to Anchor Point. I like Whiskey Gulch, and this is, and I'll show you why here in a second, but the one major thing that if you're gonna try Cook Inlet is everybody knows about the tide and currents in Cook Inlet, right? They're just impossibly fast. You have to time it. And so we launch, we know we're gonna get drifted either north or south, depending on if it's an incoming or outgoing tide, but you also know that you're gonna come back up. Well, this is from experience, but I think if we had a written test and a secret test, you know, if I said high tide equals slack tide, true or false, I think most people would say true. And it is absolutely false from an information point of view. Okay, let me explain that a little bit. All the book high tides typically are for the shoreline. And if you fish Lower Cook Inlet off of powerboat before, you know what a lot of guys do is they'll fish kings, and then as the tide starts to slack near shore, then they'll pick up their salmon gear, run off 5-10 miles offshore, because the tide's still running out there. The tide further offshore stops later. And so here's an example of that. This is off my Navionics, but it's off of the Anchor Point area. You can see here that, let me see which example I'm going to use. 9:46 a.m. is the low tide, is the book low tide for Anchor Point. But here, this is depicting current. Zero current is at 10:24. It's a full 45 minutes later, and we fished even further out, so it can even be later than that. Why is that important? Because twice when I was a rookie, I went and launched. Okay, oh, book high tide says, what is it? Oh, it's 9:46. Okay, we should be turning around about now. We should be turning around about now, and all of a sudden I'm still drifting. Oh my gosh, I got to get back to the launch. Maybe I screwed up, and so I'll start pedaling back. And you just cannot pedal against current, especially if you have wind coming against you. I didn't have my Outbacks. I had these cheapo paddle kayaks. Me and a friend of mine paddled for what felt like an hour, and we finally gave up. We headed to shore. We walked like 3 miles back to the truck, and we just said, what went wrong here? Had we just waited another hour knowing that this was true, we would have, you couldn't help but to go back because the current's just as hard going the other way. So this is very important to understand that high tide is not the same as slack tide. Lower Cook Inlet, the nice thing about Lower Cook Inlet for Kings, the hot time for Kings is coming up here mid-April through about the end of May. We catch fish in like 10 to 15 feet of water, 5 feet down, 10 feet down. In fact, this year one of the things I want to try is if I can see if I can't get a strike on video for off the top water baits. I think that'd be kind of cool to see a king smash and a bait on top water, but it's super shallow. Resist the urge to go out, and besides, most of the time you'll see a lot of power boaters out there. I love seeing power boaters out there because they make the best fish finders by far. You can sit there and look at your little screen, but oop, he hooked up. And these fish do travel in schools, so be conscious of that. Obviously, keep your distance, be polite. But they do travel in schools. If you see somebody hook up, if you can stay out of their way, I wouldn't be too shy about not heading that way. I mentioned a little bit about wind. Let's say you're drifting south and the current starts turning the other way, and you're kind of sitting there going, oh, I can just sit and drift and I'll come back. But if a north wind kicks up, these kayaks don't have much hull in it. There's really nothing grabbing the kayak so much. A 10-knot wind will stop you dead in your tracks from coming up. There's two ways to solve that. You can paddle or pedal. It's a little bit of work. Or you can take like a drift buoy, drift sock with you, right? And it'll pull you back. The tide will turn, but sometimes when the tide turns, the weather can get bad. You just need to know that you're not going to just sit there and drift back necessarily against a pretty tough wind. So one of the main reasons I like Whiskey Gulch is this King Conservation Zone area. And this is just straight out of the regulation book. You can see that if you launch out of Deep Creek, which is right here, there's a 4-mile zone, so about 2 miles of it is to the south. That means once you launch, you can either take a truck and drive down the beach, which many people do, or you got to drift out of that zone for 2 miles, and then when you come back, you got to drift 2 miles. It's actually, I've caught a ton of kings there. It's a really good fishery, maybe even better than Whiskey Gulch once you get onto the fishing grounds. But to me, every minute of time that the bait's working ups your odd. Whiskey Gulch is right in the middle of this. Now you have to be really careful. It's only probably a mile to the anchor point line. I know a few folks that have been ticketed for that. It's a little bit further up to the Storiski Creek zone. But the beauty of Whiskey Gulch here is you can launch and you can start fishing right away. Unless you just happen to be in the anchor point area, I do not recommend launching from anchor point. And the reason for that is it's super shallow, and I will show you that here in a second. Well, why does that matter? Well, it's because the way the surf breaks. Once again, I said that the chances are the only time you'll ever flip is coming in and out of surf. Well, at Whiskey Gulch and Deep Creek, the shoreline is steep enough that the surf breaks right onto the beach. So, you might get hurt when you get pounded into the beach. No, you won't get hurt, but you will, you're right on the beach when you flip. Whereas at anchor point, the surf breaks oftentimes, especially at low tide, a quarter mile, 100 yards offshore, and it's still 6 to 8 feet deep there. And so if you flip, you're kind of bouncing along, and from experience, I would tell you not to try that except on the calmest, smoothest days. Also, the other bummer at anchor point is, once again, because it's so shallow, if you launch at high tide, you're only 10 yards from your vehicle. But then you come in at low tide, you're humping your kayak back like a half mile across the beach. So it's a really good area. I fish that area a lot, and I'll show you why, but I always launch out of Whiskey Gulch. So Coho fishing, once again, I don't do as much of it as I should, but it's just a super fun fishery with the kayak. Everything's right near you. You know, the acrobatics, instead of looking at it from a boat, you know, they're kind of jumping above your head. And so it's a super good fishery. I do it mainly out of Seward and Valdez. Valdez, my only experience has been during Labor Day weekend. It's just a long ways to go, but I'm going to see if I'm going to do a little bit more of that this year, because I also want to hit Lake Louise for lake trout. But these are Valdez fish, Seward, and let's see. So I kind of got ahead of myself. But the locations, I have caught fish in Cook Inlet as well, but when it's on in Seward and Valdez. And so those are the places I normally go. Terminal tackle, I use the same thing as that I do for Kings, basically. Anything will work that you use off a boat. And I should have been better prepared here, but give me one sec. All right, so some of the issues in coho fishing, you know, I guess mainly it's you either troll or you mooch. And so just an idea of what happens, and I'll talk about a few lessons learned here. This is a coho trolling, and you might have noticed that my rod went backwards. That's because I was using those ram mounts. You cannot use a ram mount for mounting your rod holder. I hope there's no ram rep here. But they're just not sturdy enough to hold up to a big flasher, big fish hitting it. I use Scotty Orcas and Folby mounts exclusively, and I'll show you that here in a sec. Mooching's a really fun way. If you troll around and you find the salmon, you know, mooching's a lot of fun. You're right there, you're on top of them. This is a very typical, like a Shimano salmon rod. I've had like 3 of them. I've broken all 3 of them because of the fact that they're typical, they're light, you're high sticking them to try to get the fish into the net. That's why I don't use them anymore. But yeah, this is just a blast. Now, if you look at where I'm at, that's Miller's Landing right there. And so this is in mid-July. It's about the earliest I've ever found a pod of silvers there. A lot of times they're out more by Tensina Creek or a little further, but that pocket right in front of Miller's Landing is a really good place to fish. I would say I catch 75% of my cohos, and I've kind of gone up and down the side. You know, I always go by it. I'm never leave fish to find fish. You've heard that before. But I do, because I try to experiment around. I'll go all day without catching anything, and then I'll come back 100 yards from the launch. You know, I limit out. This is this is a Valdez, and it's about 5 miles to here, Gold Creek. And so, kind of the next set is you'll be able to see that I use a downrigger. And so a couple of things here. I don't need a downrigger for this fishery, but I was trying to practice. I was trying to try to get some video footage. But you can see that the downrigger, you want it as close to the kayak as you can. Otherwise, it's just going to act as a pendulum, and it'll turn you around. So you're just letting out some line. And you can see that it's pretty easy. And you can see that I'm not really pedaling. Once I get going, and as long as I have some line angle behind me, you know, you're okay. So you can do this with a paddle kayak. It is a little more tricky. You need to go with the wind, or, you know, in such a way that the kayak is at least moving somewhat relative to the water. And so, I mean, this is how good the fishing was here. I just lowered it. Oops, a little too deep. So I pull it back up. It's about 25 feet of water. One of the things I would caution is that you can't tighten up, and I lost my rod holder the day before. That's why I'm using this. Another lesson learned there. But as soon as it's in the rod holder, you know, I get a hit, boom. I don't mind these rods. The ugly sticks, you know, a lot of people don't like them. Oh, you know, they're the cheapo kitty rods. They're heavy. Well, it really doesn't matter if they're heavy if you just got them in a rod holder all the time. And I'll be the first to admit, I'm a meat fisherman. And so I tend to play my fish a lot faster and harder. Everybody's always amazed at how fast I can land my fish. Well, off a kayak, it's pretty easy. It's the evil secret that I guess I'll tell you guys, is that, you know, everybody's like, wow, this kayak fishing, you're such a stud, you know, that's got to be so hard. And what they don't realize is it's 10 times easier to land a big fish off a kayak than it is off a powerboat, because a powerboat's pretty much static in the water. There's, you know, very few fish that are big enough to pull a kayak, I mean a boat around. But a kayak, once again, it'll move around, so it just kind of acts as a buoy, and boom, next thing you know, the fish is right next to you. And you'll see examples of that in the halibut fishing videos that I have. Yeah, this is just insane. You know, I have fish jumping into my kayak. Love bragging to my friends. You know, it's kind of like some Jedi mind trick that you know, how the pros. Yeah, I've just about lost my ultralight. Got it though. See. But I have lost 3 or 4 rods. So when you come to my intro class, I say, you know, do you leash your rods or do you not leash your rods? I don't. It just kind of gets in my way. I've lost several rods. So cohos are always some fun. And so we're getting toward the end of the salmon side of things, knowing that I've got halibut coming up, and I guess that's where all my maps are. So once again, I've only been doing this for 5-6 years. I am by no means an expert on this, but as you can see through my videos, I've caught a few fish. But some of the things that I'd like to try out, and if you ever get into this salmon fishing, I'd like for you to try out and hopefully report back to me, is a lot of the in-river fishing. I think these Hobie Mirage drives, now this is where the pedal drives are going to just completely outperform the paddle drives. And it's in-river fishing. I've floated the upper Kenai. The Hobies work okay, but it's still more gravel bar hopping just because of the shallowness. The middle Kenai, it's just it's awesome. You start on Lower Skilac Lake, easy pedal out to the dunes, you know, a mile, boom, on a kayak. I see guys trying to haul, you know, go nuts with a drift boat or like their catacraft, but super easy on a kayak. And then, as a typical rule in the river, you get sucked toward the bank. As you're going downstream, rarely do you go into the middle, you kind of get sucked toward the bank. And so if you point your kayak out toward the middle, and then you're pedaling a little bit, it turns into a one-man drift boat. Whether you're bottom bouncing, whether you're pulling a plug, whether you're using a fly and an indicator, it works awesome. But there is a lot of things going on, and that's one of the reasons I don't have as many videos of it, but it's worked great for me on the middle river. I can't wait till the kings and the other salmon come back into the Kenai River so I can fish the lower river. I think these Hobie Outbacks are going to revolutionize the way non-motorized Monday begins. If you know where Cunningham Park is, which is a little bit upstream from the Kenai Bridge, not the Solana Bridge, but the bridge in Kenai, I put in there as the tide's coming in, and I can pedal fairly effortlessly. You can see that I'm just this athlete. No, just kidding, I'm not. I also smoke. But I can make it all the way past Eagle Rock on the tide that comes in, and then as the tide starts flowing out, I'm back trolling or bottom bouncing all the way back. I've hooked one king, he lost it right away, lots of silvers, and certainly the reds from the shore happen too. And then on top of that, when the wind's right, I can put a sail on my Outback. I think some of the drift boat guys are going to be pretty pissed off when they see kayaks going upstream, especially once that they've outlawed that, you know, getting a motorboat assist up. So I think you're going to be able to do it with these Hobies, so I really can't wait. Red salmon fishing, if you go to Vancouver, Canada, or some of the places like Lake Washington, you may know that there is a troll fishery for sockeyes. Word's kind of getting out on the street. You didn't hear it from me because I don't want to piss off all the Kenai River guides, but they're doing this at the inlet or the outlet, a Skilac Lake into that Kenai in the Middle River, trolling really tiny plugs, like little red flatfish. Down south they use just bare red hooks behind a flasher. They think it's krill or something, and they hit it. I will tell you that bare red hook thing works great. I have yet to catch a salmon off of it, and I'm going to keep trying. But my son and I were in Seward, and you know, I had heard about this, and it was about the time the reds were coming in to Resurrection Bay. And so I was trying for a few hours to catch the reds with red hooks trolled behind a flasher. we caught everything but reds. We caught cod, we caught pollock, we caught flounder, we caught rockfish. It's amazing. They definitely think that it's something to eat. So don't laugh too hard when you see somebody trolling a bare hook. It does seem to work. I don't really do much pink salmon or chum salmon fishing. I love fishing chums in the rivers. I think they're really underrated fish. But one of the nice things about learning how to fish pinks and chums, at least for me, is that I'm getting really tired of paying $10 a tray for herring. And you'll see in the halibut fishing, I'm a bait fisherman. I will cover some lures. But now, in many areas, Resurrection Bay, and also I believe in Cook Inlet, pinks and chums that you catch sport fishing, you can use for bait. And a lot of times, they'll outfish just a regular old herring. And so once again, you know, there's just a whole lot of areas that I haven't tried yet. And it seems like every time I go out and try something new, it just works. It's very amazing to me that A, you can catch kings in the wintertime. B, you can catch them 20 feet from shore. This year, halibut fishing. The kayak fishing team has, we've been hitting halibut all through December, January, February. It's too bad we couldn't keep them in January. We hit them pretty hard. Some of the other guys did. February, right off the Homer Spit. I even got intel just today that the halibut that they're catching right now in about 30 feet of water off of Whiskey Gulch already have hooligan in them. So if you guys like that hooligan dip netting, they're already coming. So that'll be something to keep an eye on. But go ahead and try new things. It's a lot of fun. You don't have to worry about pissing off the captain or you being the captain and you know, messing other people up. Just the one nice thing is you kind of one-man crew out there. So definitely experiment. And like I tell everybody else, I'm happy to give up my secrets, but share yours too if you would. Some of the resources where you can share that is the site that I recommend most, and this is not my site, but it's northwestkayakanglers.com. The best kayak fishermen in the Pacific Northwest from Washington all the way down to Northern California. They call this site home. We probably have about 20 active anglers on the Alaska side of things. This is where we plan our trips. I know sometimes, you know, I get turned off from a lot of forums because you ask something and they're, you know, they're not very friendly. No issues with this forum, just a ton of good guys. Other than on the water experience, this is where I learned everything I know. Yakangler.com is another good site. This is a more national site. It's not really Alaska specific, but you know, if you're going somewhere else in the States visiting friends or something like that, that's another good site. AlaskaKayakFisher.com, that's kind of a cheesy, simple site that I put together. I'm more of a function over form guy, and I'm certainly not a web developer, but I do have a lot of information there. Alaska Outdoor Super Site, a lot of folks know this, AOD forums, that's a really good place, even if you don't participate. You know, that's where I check to see, are the silvers in at Valdez, you know, are they just general information of whether the fish are there or not. And of course, I would familiarize yourself with some of the NOAA sites that include the marine weather along with the weather forecasting. I guess I better plug my site just a little bit here, but once again, I'm an amateur. I hold down a real job. I don't work for Alaska Raft and Kayak, by the way, but I love their service. They're the Hobie dealers here. But this is my site, AlaskaKayakFisher.com, and I try to keep a lot of the videos updated. It'll give you specific information to at least what I know on the species, location, gears, and some of the research I do. So here's some other useful apps and resources. I guess I kind of doubled up here, but Navionics, it shows some of the maps. I'll go ahead and fast forward to some of the halibut ones for the people that have to leave. Tide apps are important, Homer webcam. Here's the Kachemak Bay buoy. You can see it's reading this buoy here. And on this particular day, which was, today. Oh, that's right. And so it'll have it goes on further to have a list of times. It gives you the wave height, period, and just as importantly, the direction, southwest. Southwest at 3 feet, it's going to be pretty choppy. Now, if things are coming from the east, it's probably not going to be as bad right up against the spit as it is out here. And you can imagine that this buoy also, here's anchor point right here. So this buoy's, That's not me. But you can imagine that this buoy is a pretty good proxy for what happens up here as well. And then finally, for the salmon, I would just, another plug, once again, my son is part of the Hobie kayak fishing team, an elite team of kayak anglers. I'm part of the Coho team. They make the dry suits and PFDs. And so I really want to thank them for the opportunity. This is the first year that I've accepted any sponsorship because I really wanted to stay away from that so that I wouldn't be biased, but they're a really good bunch. They kind of made a deal that was too good to pass up, and it really is an honor to be able to represent two of the top manufacturers in kayak angling. I also want to thank Alaska Raft and Kayak. They do have the kayaks down there. They have one Outback, the limited edition. That's the kayak my son and I use. And then they also have the Pro Angler. I would call it a boat. If you're a young guy that just lifts weights, yeah, you could probably use it. It's a little harder dragging it up and down the beach. Obviously, I'm not fitting of that description. But if you have like a dock or you can trailer it to a boat launch, it's an awesome, awesome boat. I wouldn't call it a kayak, but a human-powered one.